Hey everyone, it's 10 Types, and today we're talking about what might just be the worst designed Pokemon card ever, Misty. And it's a card in Pokemon TCG Pocket that it says supporter, and it says you choose one of your water Pokemon, you flip a coin until you get tails, and for each heads, take a water energy from the energy zone that attaches to that Pokemon. And if you don't know, the energy zone just has infinite energies, and taking it out does not use your energy attachment for the turn and it can take it out even if you're using a different type deck. Does that really matter for Misty? No, not really. But I figured I'd get that out of the way in case you didn't know that if you haven't played Pocket. But Misty is a supporter that people don't like, including myself. And I asked on my YouTube channel what people thought the worst design cards were in Pokemon TCG Pocket, and I think everyone said Misty. Maybe one person didn't, and this video is being recorded obviously before it's being posted, so theoretically people could have said other things after that, but pretty much everyone said Misty. There were some other cards mentioned, but Misty is a card that has terrible game design from a lot of different perspectives, and we need to look at it in all the different cases because this isn't just a bad card. It's really, really, really bad in terms of game design, not in terms of power. Misty, in terms of its power level, is actually, in my opinion, it's balanced. It's within the realm of balance. It's strong, but not broken. I recently ranked all the trainers in Pokemon TCG Pocket, and I put it somewhere near like the middle to upper portion of the cards. Obviously, it's very good in water decks and almost the main focus of water. I'm not sure if people would say that or an attacker like Gyarados EX or Articuno EX, but regardless, Misty is very strong within water decks, but then obviously you would never play in another type of deck, so comparing it to something like Professor's Research or Pokeball or even Sabrina, which are considerations and really played in almost every deck in the game, Misty obviously doesn't live up to that. But what it can do is it can win you games. The strongest Pokemon, the strongest Pokemon in the game in general, just EXs, and water has a bunch. It has, I believe it has five. I'm just going to take a quick look here on the Limitless database, and that's weakness to water. Um, they're 10. Yeah, so there are five unique water EXs, and two of them are basics. Lapras EX is card that I might talk about in another video. It's kind of bad. It's outclassed by Articuno EX. So you can group those two together, the basics. Blastoise EX is ultimately not very good, though there are some interesting interactions with Misty, which we might talk about. Then Gyarados EX and Starmie EX are each stage 1s. Gyarados EX is a stage 1 that takes a lot of energy, 4 energy, and there is no other form of energy acceleration outside of Misty for water type. And then there's also Starmie EX, which is a cheaper water attacker. It's the cheapest of any of them. Yes, Blastoise EX and Articuno EX each have 2 energy attacks, but Starmie EX can only attack for 2 energy, and its main attack is for 2 energy, and obviously it's stronger than 40 for 2 on Blastoise or Articuno. And you can ignore colorless energy in Pocket. That's, again, a discussion for another video, which I might talk about soon. But regardless, Starmie EX is a card that doesn't necessarily have as much synergy with Misty, which is actually kind of weird because, Starmie and Misty go together. But regardless, Misty can theoretically get, I mean, people say infinite energy in play. Obviously, you can't actually get infinite energy in play, but you could get a lot. I've seen as much as somewhere between like 7, 8, maybe 9, something like that, heads in a row. Obviously, you need to flip a bunch of heads in a row to get a bunch of energies. And so breaking down the odds, and on average, Misty will, I believe, accelerate exactly 1 energy with every time you play it on average. Obviously, each time you play it, it probably won't. Half of the time, it will literally do nothing. You'll just choose a water Pokemon and play, and you'll flip tails, and that's it. And we'll break down this from both playing with this card and against this card because a good card design needs to take into account both ways, and bad card design can be bad if it's bad in either way. For example, cards that are just bad in terms of like they're really weak are not good card design because they're not fun to play with because they're just terrible. And then cards that are super broken and overpowered are not fun to play against. And that's another form of bad card design. But it could also be a card that is really complicated that takes a lot of time. That's bad card design because it's unfun to play against because you won't be able to play the game much. And cards that are overly simple are also generally boring because and therefore bad card design because you won't be doing that much compared to your opponent. Some people do like simpler decks, but if you're not really doing anything compared to your opponent, you can't really make any decisions, then that's generally considered bad card design. For example, something like Iron Thorn GX, I think, would be in that category. Though it's a card with a lot of baggage on it. But Misty is a card that is, in terms of complexity, I think it's fair. In terms of balance, I think it's fair. But if you play it and you flip tails, then nothing happens, and that's really bad. If you play a supporter and it just doesn't do anything, that feels terrible. Obviously, you could play something like Sabrina or Giovanni and not get value off of it. You don't want to play these cards every turn, but generally they do something. Theoretically, you could have Sabrina, your opponent only has one Pokemon to play, it doesn't do anything, but it's a card, you play it, you know what value you're going to get. Misty, you could play it and get no value, and half the time you'll get no value. The most common outcome is that you get no value out of all the different circumstances that, or results that could happen. And on the other side, playing against Misty, because the most common outcome, most common as in the highest like likelihood, it's not half the time it'll happen, and the other one, and then like a quarter, it's one hence. Anyways, half the time your opponent won't get any energy, so it feels like that's just what to be expected. There are three ways, like three categories you could look at a card in. You could say when a card's played, you feel happy, neutral, or sad about it. You could just break it down that simply. And if you're playing Misty and you get zero heads, you're sad. That's bad. You obviously don't want to be sad when you play cards. And if your opponent plays it and they get zero heads, it's generally a neutral feeling. It's like, okay, that's kind of how it should go because that's very common. You don't feel necessarily super excited about it. You might, but you might not. And so there aren't really any good outcomes with flipping no heads. No one is happy about it. Maybe your opponent's a little happy about it, but you're almost certainly more unhappy about it than your opponent is happy about it. General net negative, that's another sign of bad card design. And then this isn't obviously what the card does. It doesn't just do nothing. It does something. Sometimes it sometimes does something, which is yeah, it's not ideal, but Pokemon has decided to lean into coin flips. When I was planning on making a video talking about all the bad card designs, there aren't that many. Misty is definitely the worst, but there are some others that I'm not a fan of. A lot of them were ultimately coin flip cards, and some people like coin flips. But Misty, you're not necessarily flipping a lot of coins. You're only flipping a lot of coins if you get lots of heads, which we'll get to at the as the third scenario. But the second scenario I'd say is flipping one heads. This is the scenario that is the average situation in terms of number of energy accelerated. It's kind of what this card is, you could say, supposed to do. That means when you play it, if you get one heads, you'll feel content with that probably because that's what it's supposed to do. That's what it does on average. But then if you're playing against it and your opponent gets a heads, I mean it's less likely that they get exactly one heads than exactly zero heads. So it feels a little annoying. I'd say this is the best outcome in terms of both players being happy and also in terms of game like balance. If the supporter was just accelerate one water energy to one water Pokemon, I think that would be good. I would actually like to see the supporter change to that. The supporter then becomes better, but we'll get to it. As I said, the third scenario, which is the scenario that people talk about the most, and that's where multiple heads are flipped. Two heads, you have a 1 in 8 chance. You have a quarter chance in getting that or higher. So the likelihood of getting multiple heads is, as I said, a quarter. So Misty can do that. That's not common. You're definitely getting lucky if you do this, but a lot of people talk about Misty like it's broken because it always accelerates multiple energy. That's what people say. Some people, not that many people, but I've definitely heard it a few times where people are like, Misty is so good because it accelerates multiple energy. And it can, but it often doesn't. So playing against it, if your opponent flips multiple heads, you feel quite unlucky, and you are unlucky, or your opponent, I guess, would be lucky. And then if you're playing Misty, you get multiple heads, you're happy, but you're not necessarily super overjoyed. So I definitely say this situation feels like a big net negative, not to a similar extent to flipping zero heads. Obviously, the person with a negative feeling gets flipped. But Misty is ultimately a card where pretty much none of the circumstances are particularly good. But then we look at the things that make coin flips good. And in the Pokemon TCG, the regular TCG, You can look at a card like Maractus, I'd say is a card that is a good coin flip card. I'd say a bad coin flip card is Pokemon Catcher. So Maractus is not in standard, Maractus from Sword and Shield, but it is a card that is fun, and I figure it's a good example, and its attack Powerful Needles says for 2 energy, flip a coin for each energy attached to this Pokemon. It does 60 for each heads. This card is not a competitively was not a competitively viable card at the time it was printed. It was at best a rogue deck, but really not. It was bad. It wasn't unplayably bad, but it was bad. But when you play it, you got to flip a bunch of coins theoretically because you pair it with a card like, for example, Cherim, or I think Porygon Z was another partner. There might have been some other. In theme format, you pair it with Eldegoss. So there are a bunch of different Pokemon you could pair this with, and you get a good chunk of energy on, let's say, 6. You flip 6 coins, and that's kind of fun. You flip lots of coins, you can do a wide variety of damage. You could get really lucky and take a big one shot, or you get really unlucky, but you're flipping a bunch of coins every time. As I said with Misty, you're not always flipping a lot of coins. You're generally not. And also, if you are flipping a lot of coins, you know what the outcome is. Misty is only a funny supporter when you flip, say, 5 heads. If you flip really, I think any less than that, it's not funny. It's just what the card does. Maractus is a card that's almost always, if you're attacking with it with a bunch of energies, you're always flipping a lot of coins. You have this funny feeling. It's kind of silly, and a card that I know a lot of people really appreciate this card. On the other side, Celebi EX is very similar to it. If you haven't seen Bractus, but you've seen Celebi EX, but you're looking at this and thinking, wow, these are like the same card. And yeah, they are. And also you can see how much lower the power level is in Pocket by just looking at the numbers. Bractus being a single prizer, Celebi being a 2-pointer. But anyway, Celebi EX here, it's the same attack. For each energy attached to this Pokemon, you flip a coin. It is 50 for each heads. Same attack cost, um, slightly different stats, but pretty similar. Celebi EX, I think, is a decently designed coin flip card. I know some people don't like it. Ultimately, my issue with this, I think it can be very fun, but ultimately it's a card that's really good, and coin flips being very significant to people who want to just play seriously to win can feel really bad and make the game feel very luck based. Pocket, some people say it's just luck. It's not just luck. I don't think really anyone thinks that. Obviously, there are games that can come down to just luck, and that happens. But definitely, there's a lot of actual decision making within Pocket. But something like Celebi EX means that games can feel like they come down to luck, and that's obviously not fun. Generally, it can be funny from time to time, though. In Celebi EX, you can get a bunch of energy on the board with Superior, and then obviously just attaching a bunch. You could also use like Lilligan. I don't think people are really doing that, but that is a thing you could do. And so you can get a bunch of energy on Celebi, and that's kind of fun. And the range of outcomes, if you have, say, 4 energy, which is the same thing as attacking with Zapdos EX, is you could theoretically miss all of them or get all heads, and that's really huge. But ultimately, it's probably going to be between 1 and 3 heads. You have some range of damage. You have some idea of what could happen, and so you can kind of plan on that. Misty, you have a 50% chance of doing nothing, right? So you can't really plan on Misty the way you can on Celebi EX. And Celebi EX is obviously random, but definitely, in my opinion, feels much fairer. On the other side of things is Pokemon Catcher, or also Crushing Hammer. Crushing Hammer is a card that I think a lot of people don't like, but it hasn't been that good. Pokemon Catcher is a card that has been pretty well. Crushing Hammer has been good, but recently hasn't been. But Pokemon Catcher has been good, and is still good. It's an item card that says you switch one of your opponent's active. Okay, so apparently this translation is old. I don't know why it says that. But you flip a coin. If heads, switch in one of your opponent's bench Pokemon to the active spot. I believe this is just like this print. So that's the outdated one. But anyways, you flip a coin, and if heads, you do a gusting effect. And that's what this is generally called. And that is obviously good when it happens, and it doesn't do anything when it doesn't happen. It doesn't take up your supporter slot. Pokemon in the regular TCG generally doesn't print supporters like that. And even in Pocket, there aren't that many coin flip trainers. I can't think of any outside of Misty. I don't think there are, but there aren't many certainly. And Misty is card that has this kind of high upside. Because Pokemon Catcher, well, there's a card called Prime Catcher and Standard. If you don't know it, it's like super good. It's arguably the best card in the game. I wouldn't say it is, but I'm sure there are people that would. And it's like this, but it's an ace spec, so you can only play one of it in your entire deck. So it's super good. Pokemon Catcher, if you flip heads, it's an ace spec caliber card. It's like the best card in the game. And if you flip tails, it doesn't do anything. Misty is kind of like that. If you flip tails, it's literally useless. If it's heads, if you flip multiple heads, it's kind of broken. But then you need to talk about the reason, like, because cards like Pokemon Catcher, if you get lucky, it's an interesting card filling a unique role within the game. And it's also a card that has some interesting upside. Comparing it to Prime Catcher, you can only play one Prime Catcher, so that's why those cards are different, and that's why Pokemon Catcher is a card that might want to play instead of Prime Catcher, because you can't always play Prime Catcher. And then in terms of boss's orders, it's a supporter. So Pokemon Catcher offers additional value, and also compared to Counter Catcher, you can't always play it. So Pokemon Catcher has a unique niche that it fills and adds something to the game with its coin flip aspect to balance it out. Misty, on the other hand, we're looking at the water EXs. These EXs are good. They're not all good, but they're generally pretty good and arguably some of the best attackers in the game right now. And Misty allows them to power up. It's almost necessary to flip heads, and if you play two Misties throughout the course of the game, you have a 25% chance of getting no heads, literally getting no value off of your Misty. Sometimes I've seen people just flip tails in the first Misty and just quit. Like, don't do that, by the way, but it's annoying. But yeah, people just do that, and the fact that this one coin flip, because if they flipped one heads, presumably they wouldn't. And these are situations where they're still like in the game, but it's so determining on the outcome of the game. The coin flips, just the difference between one heads and one tails, is that a massive deal? It can certainly swing the game. It's not always going to swing the game, but it will certainly do it sometimes. But the difference between two heads and zero, which again, pretty different odds there, but the difference between those two is in terms of actual outcome in the game is crazy. Like two more heads is going to probably win you the game. And I do appreciate that Gyarados EX is a card with more energy, because having more energy or a higher energy cost means you can actually get value out of the more heads. So if you flip five heads, it's actually funny. And you actually get value off of it on Gyarados EX and Blastoise EX. If you flip five heads versus three heads with Articuno EX, it doesn't matter like really at all. Theoretically, it could in certain very niche situations, but generally it just doesn't matter. And also, I am not a fan that you have to choose exactly one Pokemon before you play it. Theoretically, it's good to speed up the course of the game. I'm sure that's why Pokemon did it. But ultimately, it means that you can't spread the energies around your board with Misty if you get a bunch of heads. So if you get a bunch of heads, it's kind of useless. Now, admittedly, there is Vaporeon, which does let you spread the energy across your board. And so in that situation, getting lots of heads with Misty is more interesting, but ultimately, is Vaporeon that good? Like, no, it's kind of unreliable because you need Vaporeon and a bunch of different Pokemon in play. Then you also need a bunch of heads on Misty, so not necessarily for Vaporeon to work, but in this hypothetical situation, you need to get absurdly lucky, and that almost never happens. And while we are talking about fun high roll situations, ultimately they almost never come up. Yes, the lots of heads with Misty does come up, but lots of heads with Misty plus this perfect board that people don't even play is essentially impossible. But Misty is just a card without super interesting upside, and its upside is theoretically really high, and its downside is really unpleasant. It's not necessarily completely terrible, like missing a supporter in Pokemon TCG Pocket. If you don't play it every turn, it's fine. Um, you certainly won't play a supporter every turn in most games. And then, well, I actually don't know how long most games go. If someone doesn't quit, then you probably don't play a supporter um, in a turn in most games. And then if you, I can't believe I just lost my train of thought. But ultimately, with Misty, it's just a card that it's not fun. There are a lot of other trainers in Pocket. As I said, I was just talking about them, and they're more specific, and they have these cool little combos that some people like and some people don't. But Misty is a card that is just so good when it's good, and so bad when it's bad. And on the other hand, it feels to your opponent, it feels so terrible. It's a card that just feels bad. It leaves a bad taste in your mouth. And I'm interested in hearing down below if people have cards that they think are worse designed than Misty. Uh, as I said, and I've talked about why it's badly designed. Its balance is okay. I will admit that. I think its balance is okay. Some people would say it's too good, but it's certainly not like the best card I've ever seen. It's not the best card in pocket. In terms of cards that aren't named Professor's Research and Pokeball, it might be the best card. I think you could make a case. I don't think it is, but I've seen cards that are more broken than this, and then I've seen cards that are. It's pretty random. I can't think of any card that the randomness feels worse. There are some cards like Neo Slowking, which is a weird card. I actually, this might sound like super weird. If you don't even know what the card is, I don't really consider it to actually be a card. But that card was super terribly designed. It got mistranslated, so it's a big mess. And there's some other old cards that are really terribly designed. But ultimately, Pokemon was going through growing pains, and Misty, is in Pocket, and yes, Pocket is a new game, but it's also not really a new game. Like it's heavily drawing from the Pokemon TCG, the regular TCG, and also I'm sure it's drawing from other games. Maybe Marvel Snap is one that I've played that I know of, but I know there's a lot more that it's drawing from. So, anyways, I hope you enjoyed the video. Consider liking, subscribing, hitting the bell, and tell me down below in the comments what you think about this support or what you think about other cards in Pocket as well. But I hope you enjoyed, and I'm excited to see you in the next video.